Welcome to the 2YE podcast. Join us for this episode with our hosts, Ide, Michelle, and Stephanie, to discuss second year ideas, experiences, best practices, and how to make the most of your UCSD college experience. Ready? Let's start the show.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast with Second Year Experience. My name is Michelle Lara. I'm the Assistant Coordinator of the Second Year Experience Program. And today I'm joined by Dr. Salcedo with CAPS here on campus or at UCSD. And today we're going to be talking about coping with loss and change. We know this is like a pretty current topic that I think all of us have experienced in some way, shape, or form throughout this past year. So we thought Dr. Lillian Salcedo would be a great guest to have on our podcast. So I'll let Dr. Salcedo introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. If you haven't heard from me or met me before, as Michelle said, I'm Dr. Lillian Salcedo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I was invited to come on today and talk with all of you a little bit about grief and loss, but also change and transition. So I'll be providing you all with some information that I hope will be helpful.
Yes, awesome. And thank you for being here. Dr. Salcedo has a pretty busy schedule, but she always makes a point to make time for our OASIS students. So not just second year experience students, but OASIS students at large. So we're really grateful to have her here. And although I just want to preface this by saying, I know we're talking about some charged topics, but we hope to talk about it in a way that can feel productive and also like normalizing talking about grief and loss and change, and hopefully giving you some tools to better cope with these experiences that I think all of us are going through.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll start with kind of like what really is grief and loss, and what are some misconceptions that you've heard often about what grief and loss is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So, grief and loss can mean a lot of things. I think that when we think about the concept of grief or grieving or loss, one of the first things that comes to people's minds is death or the death of a loved one, losing somebody that is really close to us. And although that's true, that can trigger some grief or grief feelings around that. It can also, grief can also be the end of a relationship, or it can be the loss of a job or employment. It can be a change in our ability if we were previously physically able to do something and we go through an accident or a change that is now causing us some pain and we're not able to maybe exercise in the way that we're used to. That can trigger feelings of grief and loss. Things like a medical diagnosis can also prompt feelings of grief and loss. It can mean a lot of different things, and it's important to kind of look at that from a more, I guess, bird's eye view. Like it could encompass a lot of different things.
Right. And that makes sense that a lot of us would be experiencing some feelings around grief and loss this last year, not just because maybe we've had loved ones pass away due to COVID or other medical conditions, but it could also be just because we've had to go through so much
Oh
change
my
this past year.
goodness. Yes. Oh my goodness. I think that this has been one of the toughest years for so many of our students and just people in general. I think that we, as a country, have gone through a lot in the last year. Yes, because of COVID, a lot of it had to do with COVID and maybe COVID related illness and loss. But folks lost a lot more in the last year, I think, than any other period of time.
Yeah.
The ability to be close with other people, the ability to be in proximity with the people that we love and that we care about. spending time with each other face to face and like feeling a greater sense of community in that.
Yeah.
So I think for that reason, the last year has had a lot of different layers when it comes to grieving and lost experiences for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I apologize. That's my puppy in the background.
No
Um,
problem. No problem. I
this is
also
just,
will say that I'm at home. Michelle, you're at home. So there may be
yes.
some noises, whether it's dark, dogs barking, babies crying,
Yeah.
that folks might hear during the podcast.
I guess that's just all part of, working from home or being at school from home. It's just our lives are so intertwined now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. But another topic I wanted to talk about, just related to grief and loss, I feel like a lot of us hear about like the stages of grief and how like, okay, first I'm going to feel denial, and then next I'm going to do, and then, like whatever the stages are until acceptance. But I also know like sometimes it doesn't necessarily work in that order, or maybe sometimes not at all. So what is your knowledge of like the stages of grief and how that works? How do we process grief?
Yeah. So there's a really popular grief and loss model by Kubler-Ross. And I'm hoping that you can hear me because it sounds a little like the audio went out, but I think you can hear me. So that model by Kubler-Ross talks about different stages that we go through after we experience loss and throughout the grieving process. So those stages, and I'll kind of go through them quickly as a list, and then talk a little bit more in detail about each one. So the stages are denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And so with denial, when we initially experience a loss in our lives, we might be in shock and in disbelief. So we're not really able to process very quickly what's happening. We might be thinking like this can't be true. And so that's sort of what that denial stage in the Kubler-Ross grief and loss stage is sort of talking about.
Okay.
Anger can also, of course, come up. We can feel angry at ourselves. Maybe there's regret sort of involved in what we could have done or should have done to change the outcome, which kind of taps on that bargaining stage also. But we can feel angry with the person that we lost. This is also common in like survivors of suicide. So folks who have lost a family member in that, such a tragic way might think about that and feel really angry at the person.
Right.
Anger can arise during our grieving for several different reasons. It could even be the nature of the relationship that we had with the person. If we weren't very close with them, if we were estranged, if there was tension in the relationship. But for many reasons, anger can come up.
Right.
Depression can also arise when we are grieving the loss of a loved one or experiencing a major shift in our life. And what that can look like is having, really low energy, really low motivation. We're not really interested in the things that we used to find joy in. We might have changes in sleep or appetite, sleeping too much or not enough, eating more than we normally would, feeling an increase in hunger or a significant decrease in that. We talked a little bit about bargaining and sort of thinking about that stage. Regret can come up during that time, or thoughts of, I would do anything just to see the person one more time. Maybe if I would have done something differently, it would change the outcome of the situation. And then finally, acceptance. And the way that I think about that stage is not typically in the traditional sense of what acceptance means when we think about it in other scenarios, but really acknowledging our reality. We're not necessarily accepting what happened as like, I'm okay with it, but more of an acknowledgement that this is now my new reality.
Mm.
and how can I, move forward in a way that's congruent with my values, that I feel good about, and that I feel like significant healing has taken place.
Right.
And I can start making those steps forward. And so one of the things that you were talking about, Michelle, that you touched on
Mm-hmm.
is how sometimes when we look at these stages, folks have this idea of like, okay, I'm going to go through these stages, um, in a step-by-step denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then I'll be at acceptance.
And
So I just have
right.
to get through these initial periods, and then I'll be at this acceptance
Right.
phase.
Mm-hmm.
But what we know about emotional pain, what we know about healing, what we know about grief and loss is that it's not a linear process.
Mm.
There isn't necessarily a start and a stop.
Yeah.
Um, we might experience these feelings initially after a loss. So we can think about that as like the initial period and the start per se.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it doesn't necessarily have a traditional endpoint. And we can also navigate from denial to depression
Mm.
to anger to acceptance back to depression, right? So we
Yeah.
can kind of go sort of up and down. And that's because our healing is also nonlinear. We can have ups and downs, we can have setbacks. And I think
Yeah.
being patient with our own healing and giving ourselves permission to navigate it, and pace ourselves in the way that feels best for us. And I think when you were talking about myths originally, one
Yeah.
of the things that people also assume or kind of think about when grief and loss comes up is that there's a right or a wrong way to grieve,
Mm.
or I'll have people who both experience a grief in the same family and say like, well, my brother, my sister, my sibling is doing so much better, or they seem to not be crying as much, or they seem to be, at a different place than I am. And
Mm.
that's actually very common. We don't all grieve in the same way,
Right.
and the process is different for different people. And I think just not comparing ourselves or our
Mm.
grief to others, and just navigating that in a way that feels um, that feels better for us, and that we're taking the time that we need to do that.
Right. Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that, because I feel like that just really rings really true, especially for what we're going through now. Because even just hearing you talk about the stages of grief, I'm like, wow, I've been through all of these multiple times in the past year, just about
Mm-hmm.
simple things about like not being able to be back on campus, or not being
Yeah.
able to see my family, or just like the social injustices that are happening
Yeah.
currently, right? So
Yes,
sometimes,
Michelle.
right? Yeah.
That's like that's like a whole nother layer, right? This
Yeah.
collective grief experience.
Right.
We're being exposed to a lot of violence and just heartache when we are, watching television, or now that there's social
Yeah,
media,
just
that,
scrolling through Instagram, or,
yes, these images and videos of like violence and what's going on in our society is definitely another layer that can add to our grief, and it becomes community grief. It becomes like
right.
this collective grief experience,
Hmm.
that so many folks have of course been feeling historically, but really it's been magnified, and I think exacerbated by the isolation and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Definitely. Absolutely. And I even find myself sometimes, being like, oh, why am I having such a hard time right now? And,
Mm-hmm.
some of my peers seem to be doing just fine. And other times
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I love working from home and I can do this forever. And then
Mm-hmm.
there comes
Yeah.
other moments I was like, oh, I wanted this to be over with. So
Yeah.
I can see what you mean about, we all experience these changes and these losses in such different ways, just
Mm-hmm.
depending on where we're at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, from your experience, what do you feel like is really helpful for folks dealing with grief and loss, and
Mhm.
what's helpful and also what's not helpful during these times.
Yeah. I think that, one of the things that comes to mind um, is when we're experiencing emotional pain, there's this instinct of wanting to get away from it.
Mm.
No, I don't know anyone who loves to sit in that
Yeah.
sadness, right?
Yeah,
It's
to just welcome
terrible.
it with open
It's
arms. Yeah.
horrible. It's
I
not
am.
a pleasant feeling. It's not a pleasant process to go through, and I don't wish it on anyone.
Right.
But I think that when we are in that period of such sadness or such overwhelm or such distress and heartbreak, we at times want to speed up the process. Like, I just want to get through like what I'm feeling so I don't have to feel it anymore.
Right.
And we might be doing that through in different ways. So some of us just want to like speed through that process, and that therefore we're not being patient with where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
We get frustrated maybe if we had a day where we just cried most of the day, and so we might be hard on ourselves about that and say like, I didn't get anything done today, or I was not productive today, or
Mm-hmm.
so being sort of gentle with ourselves and compassionate about where we are
Yeah.
and what it is that we need in the moment
Mm.
can be helpful. I think the other way that folks try to get away from that emotional pain can be something that we call self medicating, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
might increase our alcohol intake, or we might start using drugs more often to numb those feelings or to get away from the grief.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's understandable. And there needs to be like compassion about that
Mm-hmm.
instead of judgment or harshness or criticism. But if we recognize that that's something that's going on for us, trying to replace that behavior with more adaptive ways of coping, doing something else that's going to get me through the moment,
Right.
like distraction. That's a wonderful coping skill to utilize when we feel really overwhelmed. What is
Right.
something that I can do right now that's going to distract me from the intensity of my distress? What can I do instead?
Right.
So those are some of the things that I think are not helpful, is sort of self-criticism, self-judgment, um, trying to push ourselves to rush through the grief and loss
Mm-hmm.
process,
Yeah.
um, self-medicating, and isolating ourselves more than what the pandemic has already done. So being reluctant to reach out for support when we need it.
Right.
A lot of times when we're in a situation like this, we think like no one is going to understand
Right.
like the depth of my pain. And because that's a belief that I'm having, it makes me less likely to reach out for help.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's possible that the folks we reach out to may have no clue what this intensity or what this intensity of emotion is, but that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that they can't support us or be there for us in the way that we might need. So
Right.
those are just some things that I think can happen as a result of our grief, to kind of be aware of and be mindful of what's going on for us, and alternative behaviors that might be more helpful.
Yeah. And those sound like just like some really good, like it sounds like just taking good care of ourselves and practicing, like self care, but also, being mindful of like being patient with our process and knowing that it's
Mhm.
not going to be an easy one, right? It's just going to
Mhm.
have to be one that we kind of work through in order to
Yeah.
heal. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right about self care. I think that one of the things, or a lot of the things that sort of go out the window when we are in a period of high emotional distress,
Mm-hmm.
is sleeping. We
Yeah.
tend to
The
have
basic
more,
stuff, huh?
yeah, the basic things like irregular sleep, skipping meals because we're
Mm-hmm.
not hungry or our appetite is low because of our mood. Sometimes mood, like low mood, depression, sadness, anxiety, can interfere with our appetite.
Mm-hmm.
And so we might stop eating, or we might not eat what the way that we know is healthy for ourselves and our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
We might engage in more isolating behaviors, like keeping away from people, not wanting to be around others.
Yeah.
And another big one is physical activity.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
we tend to just kind of shut down sometimes and not want to exercise or not want to go outside. And so, physical activity, eating well, and sleeping well are three of the most common things that kind of fly out the window when we're not
Hmm.
doing emotionally well or when we're really stressed or overwhelmed. So, those are
Right.
definitely things to observe,
Yeah.
and work to improve that if that's happening for folks when they're
Yeah.
going through something very challenging.
Yeah. And I feel like such things that seem so small, like
Mm-hmm.
eating, sleeping, making sure we get,
Mm-hmm.
exercise, I feel like make a really big difference in the long run.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've, no, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that really for the mood benefits,
Yeah.
all you need is 30 minutes of physical activity at
Mm.
least 3 times a week. And that's sort of a bare minimum that
Yeah.
I want to put out there around the mood benefits of physical activity. And Um, there's a great, I think she's a neurobiologist by the name of Wendy Suzuki, who has
Oh,
a like a 10 to 12-minute TED talk about the mood changing benefits of physical activity. So, how physical
yeah.
activity really can impact our mood, and also protect our brains in the long term. So, I
Yeah. Oh,
encourage
wow.
folks to check that out. It's like a quick little Google search, Wendy Suzuki. And I don't always love physical activity, but I know how helpful and how beneficial it is. And
Right.
the fact that there's research that supports, this bare minimum to the mood benefits. Now, I can't give you recommendations on how to build muscle or anything like that. That's not my
Right.
area of expertise, but definitely how to impact our mood and get the most benefit out of the sweat that we
Right.
can.
Nice. Yeah. And I totally agree. And I mean, I try to, even during this pandemic, I try to make it a point to at least go outside and do something at least once every day for at least like
Yeah.
15 minutes. And I think what I've really learned this pandemic, this whole year, is that I have to have like a toolkit of these things almost. Like I think before,
Mm-hmm.
what used to always work for me doesn't always consistently work for me. So some days I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, painting will do it for me. And other
Yeah.
days I'm like, no, I have to go and like go to the park. And I just have to keep trying to see what is and isn't working just for that particular day.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that um, changing it up when what we're doing isn't working.
right.
Um, and also too, we're talking about what to do when we are experiencing grief and when we're going through a major change or transition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even if we're not, we can be of support to other people that we know are
Yeah.
going through a really hard time.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we don't know what to say, a lot of folks will say like, oh, my friend is going through something really challenging, or they just lost someone they're really close to, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what to say. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things to think about if we're the support person is that there's nothing we're going to say that's going to fix it. Like, we
Yeah.
cannot bring the person back. We cannot change whatever the sort of the grief experience is for that person.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to fix it. It's really just about being there and saying, you know
Yeah.
what, I can only imagine what you must be going through. I don't know exactly what to say or how to help, but I'm here if you need me.
Yeah.
Please let me know what I can do to be helpful right now. And just asking the person what it is that they need. We don't have to have all of the answers, and we
Right.
don't need to fix it, but just letting folks know that they're not alone and that we're there to support them can be, really, really, really helpful.
Yeah. And yeah, even hearing you say that, I mean, I feel so. I think at the end of the day, that's what we all want to hear, right? That people care about us and that
Yeah.
they want to help us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's honest.
Yeah.
Sometimes folks feel like, they need to say something to fix it. Like, well, at
Mm.
least your grandparent was 80. That's not very comforting. Like I'm
Doesn't
still
make me
gonna,
feel better.
that
Yeah.
doesn't make me feel better. I still really miss my grandparent. Doesn't matter if
Right.
they're 80 or, 70 or 100. Like that
Right.
is not really comforting to me
Right.
as I'm going through that grief experience. So if
Right.
you don't know what to say, that's okay. Just say that. Be honest about that and ask the person what would be most helpful. I think that can be a powerful way to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I feel better just talking to you about this.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad, Michelle. I know that we're all going through it as, a community.
Right.
And it's a very challenging time, even though, we're a year into this pandemic, a year plus, I should say.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, the struggle has been going on for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
I think this is a really very important conversation that we're having
Mhm.
about how to navigate these experiences and get through them and stay hopeful.
Right. Absolutely. And I think we're going to be going through probably another change in the nearby future, just given that people are going to be vaccinated. UCSD plans on being back on campus in the fall. And
Mhm.
so, do you have any tips for folks on, how to deal with another new change that's, upon us? We don't know exactly when that'll be coming, but
Yeah.
yeah, coping with this new transition that we'll be going through.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think, we have all been, doing the work from home, being away from each other, and now are transitioning back to the environments that we were previously working in and learning in. I think there can be stress or some anxieties around, being in close proximity with folks if we've
Yeah.
been concerned about COVID, or, going back into the regular learning environment as we've been learning online. Some folks have said to me, learning online really works for me. And some folks are
Mm-hmm.
like, learning online has not been the best for me.
Yeah.
And I think, people are going to experience that transition differently, and they're going to have, things that they see as pros or cons to the transition. I think really assessing our own personal needs is important.
Mm.
What am I going to need moving into this transition to help me feel safe, to help me feel grounded, to help me feel like the stress that I might be feeling is manageable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, things like sleep and eating well and, exercise are, of course, going to continue to be helpful in those
Right.
scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
But assessing what our needs are and identifying what is it that might be triggering some stress for me in this
Mm.
transition, and trying to problem solve around that.
Yeah.
Problem solving can really help address a high level of stress or decrease the intensity of it.
Yeah.
Um, and so, whatever it is that's prompting or provoking some stress for me when I think about the transition,
Yeah.
are there things that are in my control that I can do that are going to help me problem solve around that?
Mm.
And the things that are not in my control, what can I do to cope with those things? So we want to engage our coping skills around the things that are out of our hands and that
Mm.
we can't control, and then problem solve around the things that we do have some control over and
Right.
can help our situation um, a little bit better. And that might be, like I said, different for different people. What makes
Right.
one person feel stressed or anxious about a transition is different than what makes another person feel a little bit more on edge. But I think identifying what those things are
Right.
and approaching them either with problem solving or coping is going to be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up those tips because I feel like, it's never too late to start thinking about what you'll need when that time comes. That
Mhm.
way, when that time does come, it doesn't feel overwhelming about, like, I don't know what I need to do or why I
Mhm.
feel this way.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
can go into it feeling a little more prepared.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Salcedo, for all of your time and talking
You're
about these
welcome.
topics. You know, I really hope that this was helpful to all of you who tuned in today, and that you are able to not only use this for yourself, but maybe use it to help the folks around you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me. It is always a pleasure. Reach out to me if you have any other questions. And CAPS, CAPS is still here, whether we are
Yes,
remote or whether we return to campus soon. We are going to be here to continue to support students and whatever they might be going through. So if you're trying to deal with something on your own and you feel like you need a little extra support or some guidance, CAP staff is, of course, standing by to provide that support. Okay.
absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Take care.